Our topic is higher education at the 21st century, and we're fortunate to have with us Dr. E. Kelly Sanford, Dr. Sanford of Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Sanford, we mentioned earlier during this first segment that we wanted you to talk about some other aspects of higher education. I think that you've already laid the foundation by noting how very, very important higher education is in the 21st century, and it will be in the 21st century. Let's have you to sort of pick up and in a real sense to deal with this real issue that since this is the 50th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, that has to do with the so-called gap in higher education between various groups and et cetera. Let's talk about it from that perspective.
Yeah, and that's a very important issue to discuss. When you think in terms of the gap that we have between, say, African Americans and European Americans graduating from high school, taking the standardized tests, there's still this gap between success in those test scores and those who are entering into institutions of higher learning. And the question becomes why? We must never forget of 244 years of African enslavement, 81 years of Jim Crow laws, leading into a very devastating 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson that made everything separate and so-called equal, but as we may very well know, it was quite unequal. And as a result of that legacy of those hundreds of years of being enslaved, not allowing human beings to have the opportunity to have equal access to education, we're talking about the fundamentals, the alphabets of learning, of just reading.
Literacy.
And literacy. And then leading into a policy that was supported by our Supreme Court in 1896 that said that things still should be separate and of course they were unequal. That then led into years after that into 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education. That was indeed the first time that school systems were supposed to have become desegregated. I myself, as you asked about my biography, was born 8 years after the Brown decision and went 7 to 8 years into a segregated school system myself in North Carolina. So when you think in terms of this gap, there has to be some idea, some notion, if you will, about that legacy that has persisted for such a long time and still continues today when you think in terms of discrimination and racism. So that causes this gap when we think about it in a real sense, and we have to give some very strong consideration to that as far as higher education is concerned. And if we can consider that, I think we can make some breakthroughs, if you will, into closing that gap within scores on the SATs, within the certain types of classes that students might take to prepare them for higher education, but more so than anything else, as far as parents' involvement in understanding that legacy as well. Dr. John Ogbu, a noted social psychologist, speaks in terms of how we need to be familiar with